Hi, Anusuya. Good to see you.
Hi, Julie. Good to see you too.
Good to see you.
You are on, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to fix something for a minute and then I'll be with you. Okay. When asked about where she sourced her stories, Gita Mehta, in a personal interview in November 2004, said to me, and I quote, "I read the autobiography of the Japanese film director Akira Kurosawa. At one point, he had to make 20 films a year to survive. There is an image in his book about how he used to close his eyes to recollect his earliest impressions. That stuck with me. I literally closed my eyes and tried to recall my earliest memories. Stories my aunts and mother used to recount about the Hindu myths, incidents that occurred with people I knew when I was young, strange stories I heard from friends, and they unfolded in front of me."
अच्छा ठीक है परसों फोन करेंगे
Please mute yourselves if you're not presenting. It's very disturbing to the rest of us. Hello and welcome to the Bengal Club Book Club discussion this evening on Gita Mehta's novel, A River Sutra. I'm Dr. Julie Mehta, and on behalf of the Bengal Club Library, the Library Subcommittee, the co-chairs of the subcommittee, the president of the Bengal Club, Mr. S.N. Mukherjee, and the club itself, it's a great pleasure to welcome our members and guests across puddles and ponds who are going to be a part of our journey along the banks of the river Narmada. In my dream job as a reviewer and interviewer of exceptional books and authors for about a decade, while working at the Straits Times Group in Singapore with my partner Harish, of the many memorable people we met and interviewed in the line of duty, Gita Mehta and her late husband, Sunny, the Fred Astaire of the publishing world, came on top of the list. Born in Delhi into a well-known family, Gita Mehta is a very accomplished woman. She's the daughter of Biju Patnaik, an Indian independence activist, a chief minister in post-independence Odisha, then known as Orissa. Her younger brother, Naveen Patnaik, has served as the chief minister of Odisha since 2000. She completed her education in India, and some of our members who are on the book club, such as Indrani Roy and even Shuklare, are her contemporaries from Loreto, where they did their intermediate. They used to call it IA, like the BA. And then she went on to the University of Cambridge at the UK. She was adjudged for India's fourth highest civilian award, the Padma Shri, in 2019, but she declined for political reasons. Always dressed gracefully in chiffon saris, that's the way I remember Gita, as a woman of great substance. She's produced and or directed 14 television documentaries for the UK, European, and US networks. Little known fact, during the years 70 to 71, she was a television war correspondent for the US television network NBC. Her film compilation of the Bangladesh Revolution, Dateline Bangladesh, was shown in cinemas both in India and abroad. Of course, she's better known for the 5 books that she's written. It is impossible to speak of Gita without speaking of Sunny Mehta, her husband, former head of the Alfred A. Knopf Publishing House, whom she married in 1965. She has one son, Aditya Singh Mehta. Her books have been translated into 21 languages and has been on the bestseller lists in Europe, the US, and in India. Her fiction and non-fiction focuses exclusively on India, on our culture and history, and on the Western perception of it. Her works reflect the insight gained through her journalistic and political background. Gita now divides her time between New York City, London, and New Delhi. Sunny Mehta, whom Harish spent a lot of time with in Singapore, died on December 30th at the age of 77. He headed a legendary American publishing house, Alfred A. Knopf, and for over 3 decades published several Nobel Literature laureates, Pulitzer Prize, Booker Prize, National Book Award winners, as well as hugely popular authors from Michael Crichton to Jackie Collins. Sunny went to Cambridge, made his mark in the world of London publishing when he co-founded Paladin, which brought out The Female Eunuch by Germaine Greer, his former Cambridge friend. And here again is a surprising relationship I find I have when I was preparing this little vignette for you. Germaine Greer was my professor at Bombay University in the 80s when she came to teach in the English department when Professor Nissim Ezekiel, the great poet, was the head of the department. So there again, Germaine spoke very highly of Sunny as a humane and very down-to-earth publisher. Sunny also relaunched the Picador imprint, which published several writers who went on to have glittering literary careers. Among them was Ian McEwan, Salman Rushdie, Julian Barnes, as well as Graham Swift. Focusing now on the platter we have in front of us, with a River Sutra on it, the plot is deceptively simple. The narrator, a retired Indian civil servant, thinks he has escaped life in the city by seeking refuge and spending his twilight years managing a government rest house overlooking the sacred Narmada. Almost instantly, he realizes his folly and finds himself encountering life in the raw, more so than he had as a bureaucrat. Strategically located near the sacred sites along the river, the Narmada rest house represents a confluence of sacred and secular spaces. So the inn actually becomes the crossroads of the lives of the many guests that flow like Narmada's own tides and indeterminate geography in and out of its doors. As the ascetic Professor Shankar points out to the narrator, and I quote, "You have chosen the wrong place to flee the world, my friend. Too many lives converge on these banks." End quote. The ex-civil servant becomes the storyteller as his life collides with those of ascetics, minstrels, tribals, monks, who all have their stories to tell. The 6 stories, loosely bound together by an active narrator who performs the function of a sutradhar or a storyteller, are about a young and wealthy diamond merchant who becomes a Jain monk. The murder of an innocent singer with an exceptional musical talent, the seduction of a tea plantation executive by a tribal woman who possesses his spirit, the tale of a courtesan abducted by a bandit and is finally driven to suicide, the story of a musician who cannot come to terms with her physical disfigurement and consequent abandonment by her betrothed, and the tale of an eminent anthropologist who becomes a mendicant of the Naga cult, followers of a tantric band of Shiva worshippers, and subsequently returns to his profane existence after saving a child from being sold to prostitution. The narrator serves as a link between the sacred and the secular spheres by inhabiting an autonomous cultural space that allows him unhindered access to both spheres. The narrator mediates a dialogic relationship between writer and reader within sacred and secular spaces as the narrative unfolds through the narrator's encounters with the pilgrims. I am now a vanaprasthi, and I'm in this forest to reflect, declares the narrator of a river sutra in the first paragraph of the novel, setting the tone for the sacred to be manifest through him. The goddess Narmada in this novel is referred to as, I quote, Her Holiness and, I quote, a whore. I argue that the sacred and the profane are constantly blurring boundaries and borders because by their very nature, they are the two faces of the same coin and cannot be contained within a strict geography. Mircea Eliade, who is a well-known scholar of Indic studies and spent many years studying the Narmada, fits well with my own argument about the boundless fluidity in the physicality of water, which by its very working is not conducive to being contained. And this is where I think it is interesting for all of us who are going to explicate this novel today to remember that this novel can also be read as a story against patriarchal domination and possession. And I make this point specifically to Nitin Bose and the story of the executive and how he had to do in the Indic concept a prayashchit for the sins that he had committed against the woman who fell in love with him. So without further ado, let's turn to a short PowerPoint that I've prepared for you. So we are all on the same page. Gurudash, maybe start on that. Lovely. Okay, so the next one, please, Gurudash, the second slide. So these are basically the 5 books that have been celebrated, but none as much as a River Sutra, which in 1993 was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. And some of the judges felt she was up against a great deal of competition, for which reason she was unable to make it to the top of the list. But nevertheless, it's a book which has been hailed as perhaps one of the most classic of novels written by a 20th century writer who brings a shine and a living experience of what it is to be a global soul and yet imbibe all that is so compelling about Indian philosophy. All right, let's move to the next one, please. So I just read this out to you, and the fact that Hindu myths, which not just Gita, but in my interviews with Amitav Ghosh, Arundhati Roy, all are contemporary novelists in world literature, they say that their work is punctuated by the tellings from the tales from their grandmothers, the Thakumar Julie tales that they heard when they were young. And this has gone on in some way to reconfigure and be represented in their stories. The next one, please, Gurudev. So myths are extremely powerful tools and can convey a whole range of meanings. In her preface to Karmakola, she makes it very clear that if we are going to take the path of speed, it will mean eventually the end of the world. Kali Yuga is characterized by speed, and Gita spoke to me about this in 2004. So you can imagine how now, more than ever, a River Sutra and the importance of myth is a cautionary note to our own self-destruction as the human race. More than ever, a River Sutra is relevant and urgent. Yes, Gurudas, the next one, please. So, holding, corralling, collating all the threads that emerge in the reading of a River Sutra. There's hypnotic lyricism, and this is why she's venerated as a writer, because of her effortless storytelling. I still remember a small anecdote that she recounted. She said, R.K. Narayan, the great teller of tales, said to her, the best writing is spared, is trimmed of adjectives. I wonder whether we can really take that as the last word. Because if you're thinking of Salman Rushdie and you're thinking of Maria Vargas Llosa, or you're thinking of Vikram Seth, brevity is not the soul of wit for these writers. But Gita does excel in lucid, crystalline narratives. Her book defies categorization. I've tried, but I've failed. At once, it's an eco-critical text. Turtles and river dolphins find refuge in your waters, she says. A feminist theory of how woman as a force of water is uncontainable, and male patriarchy will pay a price if it tries to contain the feminine. The executive story, as I said, is a case in point. It's a novel where the core values of Hindu philosophy intersect without any need to judge. And I think one of our Bengal Club book club regulars, Anju Munshi, will be touching upon this. A strong thread of love and forgiveness runs right through the tellings. Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha all exist contiguously in our philosophy. And through the Jain monk's story, which Dr. Smita Kothari is very kindly to expound upon today, she's a Jain scholar from the University of Toronto. The novel at once stresses the intertextuality between Hinduism and Jainism, and celebrates the philosophy of renunciation in all religions in India. So in many ways, a River Sutra beguiles the reader and encourages the reader. It is an open ending. There is no conclusion as a concluding thought. So it is left to the reader to configure a meaning out of her stories. Gurudas, the next one, please. So the temples along the Narmada feature quite prominently and are especially sacred for their link with Shiva's powerful manifestations. Shiva is said to have appeared in huge shafts of light as Jyotirlingas 12 times. And Diana Eck, Phyllis Granoff, and somebody we met virtually recently, Wendy Donegan, speaks of these Jyotirlingas, which become the core from where Gita Mehta makes her expositions. Temple towns of Amarkantak, Mahadeo, Rudra are on the route traversed by pilgrims and form the geographical epicenter of our exploration today. Gurudas. So, what do we take away from the River Sutra? I think the one line, if you ask me, that I do take away is that I quote, "The human heart has only one secret, that is the capacity to love." The goddess Narmada in this novel is referred to as her holiness as well as the whore. I argue that the sacred and the profane are constantly blurring boundaries. I did mention the Indic scholar Mircea Eliade, who is well known for his work in unveiling the secrets and the mysteries of the Hindu pantheon and Hindu thought, and what the Western scholars have signposted in their academic research comes so naturally to someone of the Indic tradition, like Gita Mehta, to be able to make these stories come alive and be believable to us. She makes the myth reality for the reader. Yes, Gurudash. So the Narmada is 1,250 kilometers long, and it is said to have sprung from the sweat of the meditation of the Lord Shiva. We, as Hindus, aspire to perform a parikrama, which is a round-trip pilgrimage on foot along the length of the river. And there are many, many shrines, and there are temples along the site of the banks, and the walls bear inscriptions to sculptures, and there is even a 12th century temple dedicated to Shiva along the banks of this river. Thank you, Gurudash. Next one. So just a vignette of all that we would encounter were we doing the parikrama, the journey along the banks of this 1,250 kilometer long river. And one that particularly appeals to me is this river dolphin, beautifully mentioned in the last pages of a river sutra. That is why it is such an enchanting novel to those who are interested in ecology and ecological matters, and the idea of biodiversity, the idea of sustainable development. It's a very tactical book that Gita has written. Turtles and river dolphins find refuge in your waters. Alighting herons play upon your tranquil surface. Fish and crocodiles are gathered in your embrace. O holy Narmada. This is from the last few pages of a River Sutra. Next, please. So, as I said, you can't really talk about Gita without talking about Sunny, because I think Harish, who is going to be talking about Sunny in a little while, also found that in the few days that we had with them in Singapore, way back, he comes across as the perfect partner to Gita, because both are very humble, and despite being the, charmed couple living an enchanted life in New York and in England for so many years, the darling of the writers he published, he's often remembered for his excellent touch as an editor, his kindness, his hospitality. Kazuo Ishiguro never forgets that he was a guest at his Park Avenue residence whenever Ishiguro visited New York City, and Sunny never really allowed him to stay elsewhere. Next, please. So I wanted to leave you with what kind of success it means for the greatest publisher in 100 years, as has been said about him. So you have writers from the left to right: Robert Caro, Joan Didion, Richard Russo, Richard Ford, Peter Carey, and my absolute favorite, and all of yours, I think, too, Toni Morrison. And then at the back, there is Carl Pearson. Sunny had them all wrapped around his little finger because he was so kind and he was such an honest editor and publisher. Next, please. So celebrity writers signed contracts at dinner parties on chocolate wrappers. That's how much they admired him. That's how much they wanted to be a part of Swami Mehta's publishing enterprise. And the last words that I remember about Sunny is he said, "I want to be remembered as a reader." Okay, next one, Gurudas. That's it? That's it, Gurudas?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful. Okay, so let me start the ball rolling with Professor Choitali Moitro. Is she here? Choitali, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Wonderful, Choitali. Hi. Yes,
Hi.
so please do unveil what we have in front of us today. We are all very excited, Choitali. Go ahead.
Yes, same with me. Thank you, Julie D, and hello to everybody and good evening. Now we've been meeting quite often. So the wonderful presentation and the introduction Julie D did almost says it all. I would just like to maybe add what I felt. And the first thing I felt was that this is a book on introspection. And it tries to link up the idea of a myth and day-to-day life that we all live. As we live our lives in one particular layer of us, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, a myth is at work. That is what Gita Mehta tries to explore. I also felt that in the process of doing this, she has taken the help of the intimacy with nature. As Julie D was just saying about the Narmada belt. See, we have a sort of common Indian saying that Har Kankar Shankar is applicable to the Narmada belt. So this is actually taken as a nuclear point of studying human nature, putting religion versus myth, religion versus human nature, religion versus instinct, and so on. And taking a particular incident, the monk's father, who is the diamond merchant in the first story, I thought that Gita Mehta is trying to study the types of benevolence, which translates in the Indian ethos as Shatto Rajo Tamo Gun. And here, I think he is pointing out the particular line is his benevolence has a cold mathematics. That is a line which has haunted me because sometimes this benevolence is mistaken to be so many other things in life. So that I liked, and also trying to show that in spite of everything, human helplessness is something which is able to link us all. And especially in my mind was the character of the executive Nitin. Though I find a little Conradish echo and waves coming in the presentation of Nitin, I think it's very important to keep in mind the power of the tribal people, which is again very Indian in appeal. Patriarchy is, of course, there, but more than that, how the tribal people can become such a powerful language in someone who belongs to the world of bureaucracy. And finally, the presence of Narmada, which begins the probe into Hindu myths in this novel, which have no significance in the modern lifestyle that most of us live, can be used to expose psychological depths. I think that is the success point of the novel. Have I exceeded the time, Julie D? It's a very nice novel. Thank you for the choice.
You're so welcome. And Choitali, Professor Choitali Moitro, as always, my right hand, did a fabulous job of hitting it on target. Bingo, my dear. That it is so much about introspection as well. And I know that many of our participants today will come back and perhaps refresh us with that same idea in different ways. Thank you, Choitali. That was wonderful. Anushuya. Hi, Anushuya Pal.
Hi, Julie. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you for including me in the book club. I wanted to start by saying I so enjoyed the book. River Sutra is really, I mean, it has touched me on so many various levels, starting very much with the title of the book and the fact that she chose to title it The River Sutra and the style with which she told us all the stories. Gita Mehta has kind of coalesced ancient lore as a modern narrative. And each story has a link to the Narmada or the forests around. And like you were mentioning, the way she described the dolphins and the turtles, even the topography and the natural life in the jungles, like the imagery is very vivid. The way she writes, I admire the red blossoms shaken from the flame trees by clambering monkeys, or the smell of vegetation rose from the earth as I followed the mud path. It's explicit without it being excessively verbose. And you can almost see and smell the forest. Such is the impact. And yes, starting with the Jain diamond merchant renouncing his life. I mean, it was so painful. His confusion, ultimately, when he was really renouncing, the confusion in whether he was being taken in with the tide of the decision, or was he really wanting to voluntarily renounce his opulence? I mean, that confusion inside him was so clear. And in the 6 stories, the first 3 are like stories of people from distant lands who somehow come and converge at the Narmada, like Master Mohan's son's story, as well as there's this other story about the executive at the tea estate, and how ultimately their lives come and end with the Narmada. And I liked the Tariq Mia Sutradhar kind of participation, and that there was a very delicate finesse in the way he said his stories, and where, you know, in the end you could neither celebrate nor mourn the conclusion of a life that he was referring to. Finally, of course, it's the Naga Baba story that was, it kind of shocked me into a kind of different realization about how much myth lives in our lives. And even when he comes back as Professor Shankar, I mean, notice his name, Shankar. I mean, he was Naga Baba pursuing enlightenment of Shiva, and he has given the name Uma to this girl. I mean, in every choice of name, there is so much significance. I even liked the Veena and the description of how Shankar, Shiva and Parvati and their love resulted in the instrument being born. And I mean, these are not known facts. And the fact is that the Veena is a celebrated instrument today, and we are looking at something that has origins in, is it myth? I mean, the question mark comes, was it reality? And in being an Indian, you so easily embrace all of this. But I don't know how the Western audience sees it. I mean, do they embrace it as organically as we do? I mean, Gita Mehta, being Indian, writes it in a very seamless, matter-of-fact way, knowing that her Indian audience will accept it in the same manner. But I'm wondering how it's taken by others. And lastly, of course, the river minstrels paean to the Narmada. That was just so beautiful to read. I'm wondering how beautiful it would have been to hear it. I mean, altogether, it was a beautiful experience. As on an experiential level, it was really a very beautiful read.
Thank you, Anushuya. I really liked to pick up very much in your, you know, it's in a little complex terminology. What you were really explaining so beautifully is how the sacred or the myth subtly emerges in the middle of our profane life. And being Hindus and being aware, or even Indians of different faiths, we are so aware that like a jack in the box, the sacred appears in the middle of profanity, in the middle of life, and in the middle of the sacred, you have profanity. So that's a point that is extremely interesting, that you have explained it in your own way so well. And then you're taking away the palpability from the novel, the feeling of the red earth, the waters of the Narmada, the Vano tribals, the smell, the sight, the hearing, what we call the 5 indriyas. I think you've done a fabulous job. To very quickly trying to address your point about how the Western audience reader would take it. I think, Anusuya, now it is such a global world. First of all, they are a bit more exposed than they were 50 years ago, with novelists such as Arundhati Roy, Salman Rushdie, Vikram Seth, Amitav Ghosh. All these people have tried to unpackage India to the West, and successfully so. But what I find even more interesting is that publishers in the West, and I've said this before in my research, I find it fascinating that you've come upon this question of the West and the readership. They still want exotica. The publisher will tell you, no, we don't want to know about Toronto. We don't want to know about your experience in New York. Tell us about India. Tell us about Chile. Tell us about all these little places which are tucked away. That is what the English-speaking European, North American audience wants to know. So I think there is an entire manufacturing agency that is helping to sell and market our stories from Asia, from lesser known places such as Africa, which right now is very much the flavor of the century, of the 21st century. So Anusuya, your points were very well thought out, and I think they are points that we will carry back with us today. Thank you so much. Olivia, may I call upon you to give your 3-minute response to the book? Olivia is one of our youngest members of the Bengal Club. She's come back from Canada and New Jersey and is here now, and so happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for including me in the book club. It was a great experience reading the book. The biggest takeaway for me from this book was the fact that people can coexist irrespective of their backgrounds, their beliefs, the cultures that they come from. The stories that are mentioned in the book are all interwoven, which creates this fabric that is the world that we live in today. The book is centered around the Narmada River. Sutra, which also means thread, so the river serves as a thread that kind of joins these various legends. And again, like Professor Shankar towards the end of the book says, it all converges on the banks of this river. While the book discusses many myths and legends, I feel like there were stories there that were very relatable to the human life. Some of them, for me, the ones that stood out were, let's say, the Jain monk before his renunciation, the fear that he had of abandoning his luxuries, which is very real to us, or Master Mohan avoiding the temptation of money when he was offered huge sums of money from Sahib for Imrad's voice. And then the other thing that also kind of resonated with me was a lot of these characters were also looking for some sort of escape from their regular mundane life. To start with the narrator of the story, he was looking for an escape from his life as a bureaucrat and the life that he lived in the city. The Jain monk wanted to let go of the luxuries and the world, and Master Mohan sort of escaping, the cruelty that he received from his family, or the tea estate manager who wanted to escape from Calcutta and the social life that he was leading. So all of these instances were very relatable, which made the book so real. And when I put the book down towards the end, it left me with a feeling of hope that there is optimism in this world, that people can coexist, and irrespective of the times that we're living in right now, I feel like there is light at the end of the tunnel, and we can sort of make this a better place for not just us, for everyone to live in.
Lovely overview, Olivia. Salient points brought out, and the fact that we can relate, I think that is a very important way of finding a connect between the reader and the writer. Thank you so much, Olivia. I hope we'll see you consistently on board, because it's such a pleasure, such a pleasure. May I call upon Anju Munshi, please? Anju?
Yes, here I am.
Hi.
Yes, please. First of all, good evening to everybody, and I hope everybody is safe and happy in the present condition. It's asking for too much, but one has to strive and move on. The book has been a delightful reading. With every story, a layer opened up, exposing further many more layers of Indian mythology with a mystical gravity and a cultural hypnosis, I would say, loaded with contradictions also. And there were different perspectives to look at the book. I find in all the stories, love, compassion, and empathy were the linking sutra, the linking thread, which, brought all the stories together. Whether it was Tariq Mia, Imrat, the kidnapped daughter and her mother, or Mr. Chagla, or the owner of the guest house, there was unbounded love in their hearts, a lot of understanding and humanity, which I think brought out the best in all the characters in the book, which, if applicable to us, would also bring the best in, from everyone's heart and things like that. The author also very cleverly breaks the code of mythology, and she makes them into bite-sized pieces, which become a little palatable and highly digestible. I'll just quote a couple of them. The pre-Arya invasion stands for instinct. This is from the book. The Aryan invasion stands for reason. The serpent's poison is a temptation of life. Nitin Bose has a feminine side to him, Rima. So this is Ardhanareshwari, because there is a concept of duality. There is a male and female, duality which exists in every human being. So that, I think, was very skillfully crafted by the author. And also, there is the sutra is the thread, this is the essence of femininity, which runs throughout the book. And it goes on to say, it glorifies male supremacy, and it also, quoting from the book, women can only heave on the mattress, and they can heave on the mat, even though they are trained as scholars, quote, artists, musicians, we are only women to them. Our true role is to heave on the mattress, to be recompensed by some tawdry necklace flashing its vulgarity on a crushed pillow. So there is a sense of duality here also, when women feel a little abused and not recognized for her worth. And there is another side to a woman when she is the enchantress. She is the seductive, she's the embodiment of seduction. And she is a mood of longing in the jungle, like women pining for intimacy. So there is a very subtle and a very clever interlinking of these two sides of the woman. And there are two threads, there are two sutras which go through the book. One is the essence of the women, and even the river has been like termed as a very important lady in the book, a very important woman in the book. And there is this very strong sutra of love, compassion, and empathy, which finally is the ultimate healer, which is the ultimate therapy in this world. Thank you.
How well you've brought out what is the core of Hinduism. Beautifully, beautifully explicated, Anju, and very touchingly so. I think the book is a feminist meditation, and I'm looking forward to Raka and Harsh's explication very much, because the power of the feminine and the duality of the feminine, also undergirded by the same word whore, as well as a goddess. So the incredible, indomitable power of the woman, despite that she is abused in real life. So I think that's the story of the lived reality versus what we know in our theology. You brought that out beautifully, Anju. Thank you very much for that. I'm wondering if Lily Bhaduri is here. Lily, are you here? Okay, so then let's go on and hear Vivek Krishna's views, always compelling and always so rich.
Hi, Julie, and good evening to everybody.
Hi.
I'm in the middle of a rainstorm here in Bangalore, so I hope my connection remains through what I'm going to say.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, absolutely, and toes. Well, I stepped into the pages of this book and was almost immediately swept away by the current of the river that it celebrates. A beautiful use of deceptively simple language to conjure up images stayed with me and drew me back into the novel again and again. The book plays on the concept of a sutra, as has already been touched on, literally a thread, and more figuratively, a morality delivering fiction genre. In this case, the thread that links 6 tales is the idea of time, love, desire, the human heart, lust, and music, and the holy site, of course, of the Narmada, a place of worship and community. As the author says, such people are like water flowing through our lives, little brother. We learn something from the encounter, then they are gone, and we never find them again. And between the eastern hills, I can see foaming waterfalls, where the river plummets through marble canyons into the valley below the rest house. And if I turn west, I can watch the river broadening as it races towards the Arabian Sea. I have always regretted the heavy storms that prevent me from coming to the terrace more often during the monsoons. The Narmada that is most dramatic during this season. The distant waterfalls, swollen by monsoon rains, crash through the marble rocks like surf breaking at full tide. And below the rest house, the river churns and bubbles around sudden rapids, eroding the gray-green stones lying on its riverbed into the oval lingams that are the symbols of Shiva. The first story that the nameless man hears is the monk story. Ashok grows up to the son of a rich diamond merchant and renounces his life to become a strict follower of Jain principles. Tell me, friend, which of such harsh vows is the most difficult for a man to keep? He smiled, and the sudden relaxation of his austere expression showed him to be a young man, not more than 30 years of age. This may surprise you. Non-violence. The theme of love is then picked up by the teacher's stories from Tariq Mia, the old Muslim mullah, about Master Mohan, a music teacher who dedicates all his time to teaching the poor, blind, orphan boy. And in return, he feels the appreciation that his own family doesn't give him. Tragically, the child is murdered in front of his devoted teacher, which drives Mohan to seek solace from Tariq Mia at the Narmada. And although he seems comforted by Tariq, Mohan commits suicide on his way home. Perhaps he could not exist without loving someone as he had loved the blind child. I don't know the answer, little brother. It is only a story about the human heart. In the musician's story, at the end, the ugly daughter is rejected by her father's handsome student once he has learned all the teacher has to teach him. Now I remembered my father's teachings as I tried to be the water to the river, the stranger's rag, the moonlight to his night. He says, I must understand that I am the bride of music, not a musician. But it is an impossible penance that he demands of me, to express desire in my music when I am dead inside. Do you think it can be done? Do you think this river has such power? The sages meditating on your river bank say, you are twice born, once from penance and once from love. That sums up really the pith of the story that I've read this time in the Sutra. There has been descriptions of the river twice by Gita, right? Once in the beginning, once at the end. And that also gives the feeling of how the river came to be born, once through his penance and the second time through his sweat. So it really goes from what we've all said, profane, sacred, and a wonderful storyteller to give it all to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. Loved your introduction with the words that you were taken away by the current of the Narmada. That was so compelling. And you're quite a creative speaker yourself, as we all know by now. I want to pick up on the idea of love, which also, I think, is troubling. There are no easy answers, Vivek. The suicide, the killings, the issue of how tenuous life is. There are no guarantees, you know. I think that comes through very significantly in this novel. And as you say, when you unpackage each thread in this collection of sutras, through the narrator, I think there's a third-person omniscient narrator who makes the stories so human because it's his reaction when he recounts these tellings. And that ties in with your idea about being taken away by the current, because I think the narrator plays a very low-key but a very powerful role here. Would you say, Vivek? Okay, so I'm going to call on Mrs. Nandita Chatterjee again from the Bengal Club, a new joinee for us, and we are very happy to have her on board. Career civil servant, United Nations diplomat. Okay, Nandini, let's see what you have to say. I'm sure you'll bring in a new perspective. Come on board, please. Nandini, Nandita, will you mute yourself? Sorry, it's Nandita Chatterjee. Nandita?
Yes.
Hi, Nandita.
Yes. Hello. Thank you and good evening. I really enjoyed reading this book, River Sutra. I found it was a mellifluous and a lyrical read. But this book did not cease from surprising. I thought that a continuous refrain that runs through this book is a sense of escapism. We have the protagonist, civil servant, who is turned into a lodge manager, and he's escaping to become a forest hermit. We have he meets a Jain monk, who's again escaping his life of carnal pleasures to seek non-violence, and himself says that I'm too poor to renounce the world twice. We have the teacher, Master Mohan. He's attempting to escape his mediocrity as well as his rapacious family through his ethereal muse, the little boy Imrat. We have the quintessential Nitin Basu, who is escaping his hallucinations through the tribal goddesses in the river. We have the concubine's daughter, who's again trying to escape her life of music passion, and adventure. And of course, the Veena player's daughter, who's also trying to escape from her rejection and revenge. As this name would suggest, the heroine in this particular book is the river Narmada. And she is volatile, she is vibrant, and she's also a temptress. She's tempting everybody who comes close to her. And this is a very interesting parallel, because if we go through the lives of the 6 characters in the 6 stories before us, we find each of them have been subjected to lives of temptation, whether it was riches, whether it was luxury, or whether it was carnal. Another aspect about the book that intrigued me was the fact that while the river Narmada rises at the Amarkantak hills and gradually passes and flows into the Arabian Sea, each of the characters are finding their nemesis in the river. Another attractive aspect of this book is, as I have mentioned earlier, its elegant lyricism and its sense of mysticism, where religion meets philosophy, or whereas in the words of Sufism, where you have truth and divinity meeting knowledge. At the end, however, we are taken by surprise when there is an abrupt introduction, or shall I say reincarnation, of the Naga ascetic who is now Professor Shankar. And Professor Shankar, most surprisingly, he rejects his earlier mythological beliefs. And he would insist on the scientific precision of an archaeologist. He doesn't stop his prodigy Uma from seeking a life of enlightenment, but he himself would clearly go by his life of science, his pursuit of survey, and his purpose in finding meaning to a very precise objective. At the end of it, the major takeaway that I have taken from this book is this. We are left musing over certain questions on belief over evidence, fiction versus science, and myth versus reality. There are no answers in the book. And my feeling is that the author Gita Mehta wants each of us to find replies to these little mysteries by us. Thank you.
Nandita, blown away. So good. Dr. Nandita Chatterjee, we must have you regularly on our book club.
Thank you
It
very
was
much. It's an honor.
It was incisive, and I love the intersectionalities that you brought forward between the polar opposites. Just very, very on point. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Harish, I think you will bring an element of lightness of being to our otherwise rather serious discussion. And if you can just regale us with a few interesting anecdotes or thoughts you have about Gita and Sunny and your meeting with them in Singapore. Harish, Dr. Harish Mehta.
Thank you. I'll take you back to 1995 when I was in Singapore with Julie as a foreign desk correspondent for the Straits Times. And the PR agency called Burston Marsteller, they sent out press releases to say important people are coming. And one of them is Sunny Mehta, and I took it up. So I went to interview him. So the interview was conducted at the Tanglein Club in Singapore. And so the interview basically with Sunny Mehta. So prior to that, I spent, I think, 3 days doing background research on him and on Random House. And this is what I found. That Random House was a company, the insides of it were Byzantine, ridden with cocaine using young, creative, neurotic potheads, the most intelligent, dope smoking characters between the ages of 21 to 35 were the most creative editors that were on offer. So alcohol was rife from the morning. People had whiskeys, openly being consumed. It was a complete opposite of, say, a job in academics or a job in the UN where everything is so proper, where the mere touch of a man on a woman's shoulder will invite, will set in train a Senate inquiry and a summary dismissal of the professor. Pretty much like what happened to Lurie in the recently discussed Disgrace novel. So I was shocked because, I was working for this large organization where the hottest drink that could arrive on your table was a kopi o, which in Singapore means a coffee without sugar. It's a Malay thing, kopi o, and there's something called kosang. Kopi kosang means with nothing, anyway. So here I was sitting with this gentleman. Yes, and the other thing was, in the background reading, I found that he loved Johnny Walker, Black Label. And this again was a mistake because the photographs that I saw of Sunny Mehta, a number of them, the alcohol on his table was something else. It wasn't a black and white bottle or a Johnny Walker bottle. It looked like, Hague or, something else, anyway. So Sunny, I'm interviewing, and I can't remember. And now this interview I don't have a copy of, but I did track it down to the Singapore National Library, who seem to have a copy of it in their archives, but inaccessible except and if you're in Singapore. So you have to be at the NLB to use their computers to read it. Now I used to maintain hard copies, and I've got it upstairs somewhere in this house, but I'm not going up, and I didn't bother looking for it. But what I remember from the interview was that he spent a great deal of time talking about how world literature had dethroned European literature, in global terms, and how English novelists were being dislodged from their important positions by people like Rushdie. The others that followed hadn't quite made it, the recent lot. Arundhati Roy and all, I think, came later on. Amitav Ghosh had just about written 1 or 2 novels. So Rushdie had written a few. Naipaul was there. And so he was talking from the perspective of these grandfathers of Indian literature, Rushdie and Naipaul, and how the future seemed to belong to them, and others like Ishiguro and all in the world literary firmament. He also talked about making Random House very big, and if you background him, you'll find that he, as president, was not an Indian man anymore. He was a global figure who gave out $9 million and $12 million to Bill Clinton and to Tony Blair as advances, scaring the bejesuses out of the Random House conservatives, because Random House wouldn't do this kind of thing. But he, as president, did it, and he recouped it back in spades. And then he did some other freaky things, like doing reprints of old Random House books, hardcover books, as paperbacks, and pricing them very high. And they said no one's going to buy them, but people did. So he actually paperbacked that industry, because Random House wasn't big on paperbacks. And this man came from, the lowbrow paperback industry, as publisher of Pan. So he really shook up Random House, and he shook up their thinking, and he went on to acquire other titles, other books at great cost, but he turned them all around. And he was not just a person of literature. No. He was a great a banya. He was a banya inside somewhere in his genes. He knew business. And I think that's a weird combination. And I think cocaine and pot smoking had something to do with it. Because I was blown away when I read the Rolling Stones article. Guys can Google it and read about Random House. Random House would put some of the hottest advertising agencies of Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue in the shade. Because the kinds of things that used to go on Madison Avenue were tame compared to what used to go on, and I probably believe still goes on in Random House. And
Harish,
I mean, so
Harish,
guys,
Harish, can I turn your attention to Gita Mehta for a second? Because we are very constrained on time. So we've got a
Right.
great background, but
Right.
tell us your views
So-
on Gita.
Gita. So Gita, Julie and I entertained them at the Tanglin Club for dinner that night. And Gita was, honestly, I don't remember very much of what she said. But what I do remember is Sunny every 10 minutes saying, I'm going out for a smoke, can you join me? So I don't remember much of what Gita said because most of the time I was smoking outside with him. I'm not me, I don't smoke. Watching him smoke. So when we came back, you tell me. I don't remember my Gita Mehta. Yeah, I remember. Didn't the chief minister join us? He came the same time, right? The next day or what? Oh.
Yes, her brother Naveen Patnaik, who's now the Chief Minister of Orissa. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Harish. That was a nice little vignette away from the mainstream, and we enjoyed that. Thanks very much. Okay, we will now turn the. I'll give the baton to the guests, our esteemed guest speakers, participants. Dr. Smita Kothari is a Jain scholar. She's a Jain herself, and she's taught Jainism. She's from the University of Toronto, and she's a dear friend. Smita, go for it. 3 minutes is all you've got.
Hi, Julie. I don't know.
Hi, Smita. Hi.
Hi, Julie. How are you?
Good. Good.
Thank you for this opportunity. There's been a lot of conversation on the book, very erudite, I must say. So I will focus as a Jain scholar on the monk story. I wanted to show you my cover of the River Sutra, which is a different one than yours. And rereading this book some 10, 11 years later, I just remember our conversations from when you were writing the chapter. Here's my book cover,
Yes,
which is
I
really
remember,
a sutra.
that. Yes.
A sutra, the dhara connecting us all. Anyways, so what I want to focus on is the monk story, which is the opening story connecting all these threads. And you've already outlined the sacred and the profane. I want to speak to a couple of things. One brought out by, I think it was Anju, I'm not sure about the women's role in our society, and speaking to that a little bit as well. So in the monk story, we have this jarring juxtaposition of the sacred and the profane. The father, the rich diamond merchant, and the son about to become a monk. It's a rare insight into the mind of a person taking diksha, which is the word one uses in Jainism for a person renouncing the world. And is what we find in the monk's story, the monk telling him, relating this entire story, is very interesting because Jain monks and nuns rarely, if ever, speak about their actual renunciation and what goes on in their mind. I interviewed several, had the pleasure during my research in Rajasthan to witness 10 dikshas, and one of the women doing a diksha, I had met her the previous year on the research trip when she was still a novice in an organization that has an intermediary thing. And when I interviewed her, she did not open her mouth about giving up the world of, an affluent lifestyle and about to be taking diksha. She was very quiet on the subject. So just going back, her inspiration for that particular story came from articles, very well publicized articles, certainly in the Mumbai press and the national press, of an actual monk whom I met in a very later stage of his monkhood, a bearded, maybe he was still very young, but looked with the travails of, you know, being an ascetic, very different. I also have a personal family connection. My husband's cousin, this is her brother-in-law. This is the eldest in the family. So it's a story based on a real monk whose life he's giving up. And scholars have talked about rupture for Jain men when they give up the worldly life, the profane life, versus women giving up the worldly life. And I think it was Anju Munshi that mentioned about women and the role. And what is very particularly clear when men give up, the rupture is definite. They're giving up this worldly wealth, which Gita Mehta clearly elucidates in the novel. When women give up the worldly pursuit for an ascetic life, amongst the Jains at least, their rupture is not so dramatic. They still circumscribe in the social domestic sphere. Nuns do the making of the patras, the bowl they beg in, that kind of thing. Going back to the display of the really at a loss for word for the display of wealth and the giving away. And it goes to the myth, since we're speaking of the myths, to the myth of, well, maybe not because he was a historic figure, Mahavir, who gave up the 24th Tirthankara, who gave up the worldly princely life. And that's the real rupture, all the splendor of a princely state. And when he was born, he was given the title Vardhaman. Vardhaman meant his birth brought auspicious wealth in whatever manner, sacred or profane, you may want to take. And the myths around him are, as a child, the ahimsa part, as a one in the womb, he was so afraid of causing ahimsa to his mother, hurting her by his kicking, so that he wouldn't kick while he was in the womb, except when she got worried, is he still in the womb? And he would just give her a gentle nudge. So this is the kind of myth of ahimsa around Mahavir's birth. And then when he gave up the world, he gave away his worldly wealth. So this rather lavish display of giving away the wealth. In the novel, we have this juxtaposition of the father who's obviously in pain at parting with his son and is giving away the wealth that the oldest would have inherited. And that display of inordinate amount of wealth, and the monk who's sort of outside of that, about to be taking his final vows, is just beautifully done. And I, on a smaller scale, witnessed this during the Diksha ceremonies of these 10 people. Now, it does raise the whole ceremony for people who are not as wealthy. You see this in real life, that the display of wealth by the very rich when a Diksha is happening versus a more common person. Going back to the monk story, so when the monk talks about all this display, it struck me, first of all, the juxtaposition of Hinduism and Jainism in the novel at the banks of the Narmada, which I can't recollect being so sacred a myth amongst the Jains. So to find the monk at the banks of the river and to be having this, being the interlocutor for this nameless narrator, is a very interesting setting she brings. And she brings shock at the beginning of the story and then ends the novel with the shocking image of Professor Shankara, who is the Naga Baba, who is connecting the earth and the river by now being an archaeologist, the famous archaeologist, digging the earth. My background, my history on the Narmada is more disruptive than the one Gita Mehta gives in her book. You know,
Thank
and
you,
it's
Smita. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. You know, so much to mull about, and your research, and the fact, this is what I wanted to ask you, and you've, you know, you've already second guessed me, and that is, Narmada is not necessarily a Jain place of pilgrimage or a Jain epicenter of religion, right?
not at all, not at all. Like the sites she mentions, Rudra, Amarkantak, they were my first encounters.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Smita.
Thank you, Julie.
Lots to digest there. Raka and Harsh, are you there for your presentation? Looking forward.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Harsh, thank you. 6 minutes between two of you, is that good?
Yeah, works
Okay.
fine.
Wrap it up then within 6 minutes. Really looking forward. Go for it.
Okay. So we are going to discuss the executive story in the novel by looking into it through the dual lens of anthropomorphism and psychoanalysis. So in Nitin Bose's diary, we find a geographical shift from an urban cityscape to tea gardens, where he was treated no less than a sahib. He felt a growing lacuna inside him, for just like Lord Alfred Tennyson's poem Ulysses, where the hero feels that he's ruling people, and I would quote, that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. Nitin feels detached from his staff and workers, and this isolation makes him delve into the paraphernalia of his grandfather's books. Uh, I don't know where Raka is.
Raka, are you there? I think she's having connectivity problems. Harsh, you carry on.
Yeah. So we find that Nitin had abstained from having sexual relations with any woman, thereby refraining to give in to desire. We can say that the goddess of desire that the tribal natives worshipped and feared maintained herself and manifested herself in the form of Rima, a tribal girl with whom he spent every night. The narrative technique, which describes the intricacies of their sexual encounters, intermingle with the tribal myths and their erotic interpretations. The readers experience Nitin's phantasmagoria through these images, which introduces the anthropomorphic aspect of kama or desire. Anthropomorphism here being the attribution of human traits, emotions, or intentions to non-human entities. So in chapter 8, we find Mr. Chagla saying, the goddess is just the principle of life. She is every illusion that is inspiring love. She is what a mother is feeling for a child, a man for a woman, a starving man for food, and human beings for God. A similar idea is found in Neil Gaiman's acclaimed comic book series Sandman, where one of the main characters is Desire, who is an anthropomorphic and androgynous entity who is sometimes a man, sometimes a woman, sometimes both, or sometimes none. For desire cannot be bound or gendered. To draw more parallels, desire in Sandman casts two shadows, one black and sharp, and another translucent and wavering, signifying the known and the unknown desires within every person. Narmada becomes an influencing force. It acts as one with a benevolent force and also a lustful power when it is portrayed as a symbol of a woman, a goddess who engulfs forces of life within her if men do not heed to desire. Deepak Shimkhada and Michael Redding have argued that the Arghapatra receptacle fashioned as it is in the shape of a yoni or a vulva, symbolizes deeper ontological and soteriological meanings, which find expression within the tantric context via a sexual symbol of the goddess. In other words, when a priest or devotee offers the deity water from an arghapatra, the water is being vivified, as it were, as the sustenance and grace-giving amniotic fluid of the goddess, which is discharged through her yoni. Raka, please take it from here.
Nitin undergoes a psychosexual metamorphosis. This occurs with his relocation to Calcutta that came as a command in the chairman's telegram. When he informs Rima of his departure, his enchantment with her is broken as she asks if she could return to her husband, a coolie, in his absence. Conditioned to sleep with the women of a certain socioeconomic background, Rima's economic status breaks his frenzied delirium. Although his morals did not stutter at the adulterous nature of their relationship, the idea that he shared the bed with a coolie's wife made him feel a certain disgust and shame. His gaze now viewed her limbs as squat and ugly at the break of dawn. This reminded me of the relationship between Hori and Duli, a Shautal woman in Satyajit Ray's Arunne Din Ratri, where Duli's identity was objectified because of her lower status. Nitin's repressed guilt overshadows his consciousness as he returns back to the tea estate to organize things for his successor. He tries to pay off his guilt by leaving money for Rima with the head bearer, but then the hallucinations begin. He hears Rima singing her song to him, and one evening, unable to distract himself, he goes on to the forest with Rima's voice calling his name repeatedly. This resonates with the Bengali folklore of the Nishi duck, Nishi, the night spirit, who lures its victim to a secluded area by calling to the person with the voice of a loved one. The Bengali age-old superstition suggests that this could be a representation of the phenomenon of sleepwalking. The idea that the same myth Rima narrated of trapping a man's soul in between coconut shells occurs with him suggests a development of hebephrenia or a schizophrenia that occurs by senses. Nitin heard her sing, could smell the musky fragrance, his palate enticed by their sexual relations, and he could feel the pain from the way she choked him.
The bout of madness that Nitin undergoes after this may be compared to what Jack Torrance undergoes when he spends a winter alone with his family away from civilization in the Overlook Hotel in Stanley Kubrick's movie The Shining. Nitin's isolation, his sexcapades with Rima, coupled with his newfound knowledge of tribal myths, turns him delirious and hysterical. Sigmund Freud opined in his essay, Mourning and Melancholia, the melancholic displays an extraordinary diminution in his self-regard, an impoverishment of his ego in a grand scale. The repressed guilt of Nitin therefore leads to his gradual dissociation into Rima's personality when he finally reaches the banks of River Narmada. This could be a manifestation of Freudian melancholia, where he feels the need to make amends to the deity of desire or kill himself driven by the death drive or Thanatos.
The constable's inability to understand why he referred to himself as Rima could perhaps be answered by Dr. George W. Kaiser's observation on dissociative neurosis, where a pattern of maladaptive behavior in which part of a personality known to self loses its cohesiveness and separates into two or more psychological systems. This further echoes with Dr. Mitra's observation that he was perhaps suffering from momentary amnesia due to some severe emotional strain. Finally, to purge Nitin of his idea of possession, the cure also had to be fashioned with the rituals of the tribals, where he made penance to the goddess of desire. Gita Mehta therefore successfully amalgamates anthropomorphism and psychoanalysis in the seventh string of her novel, River Sutra. Thank you.
Thank you.
Superb. I expected no less from both of you. You really are able to bring issues of feminism as well as the Ardhanarishwara. Who mentioned that? Was it Dr. Nandita Chatterjee? Who mentioned Ardhanarishwara in their explication a little while ago. Really taking back from Harsh and you and the connection between sin and repentance, the fact that there is a connection between Assam and the geography of the Narmada in the West. So there is a bridge that is being made for the reader to travel through. Raka, did you feel that as well, Harsh? That there's a bridge that is being created
Yes,
through the Vano tribal rituals, which are also connected to the tribals in Assam, thousands of miles away. I think that's quite fascinating, actually. And then when Harsh brings the idea of the anthropomorphic into the equation, it relates back again to an eco-critical view of a River Sutra. So well done, guys. Thank you so much. Both Raka and Harsh are master's students, scholars, and I think they're forging new areas in reviewing writers and their work. Thank you so much. Shikriti, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Shikriti, go right ahead.
Good evening.
Good evening. We can't see your face though, Shikriti.
Okay. No, ma'am. Turned on my video.
Yes, that's fine. Lovely. Thank you. Also, masters from Loreto College in English. Shikriti, you've got 3 minutes. Go for it.
Okay. So first of all, thank you, ma'am, for introducing me to this book and giving me this platform to present my opinions. So when I started reading this book, I almost felt like I'm invading a mind full of bright memories. The opening lines and the method of description is used by the author is subtle and has a deep sense of influence of our own culture. Somewhere in between the pages, I found a line that resonated with my understanding of the nameless narrator, that the narrator is almost like a meeting point for all sorts of reflections that different readers from time to time have been and will be drawing from this illuminating piece of literature. And that line is, spanning a mile from bank to bank, the river has become my object of reflections. This deep insight holds together the universal love, the mighty and caring Narmada River, and the nameless narrator. Earlier, I never had such a vast idea about the nature of such a pious river that I have now after reading this book. To me personally, the river itself became a sutra or a dhaga, as we call in Hindi, connecting and piercing through all the 6 different, unique and phantasmagoric experiences that reveal themselves in the form of stories, containing the impressions of generations of thoughts and magical beliefs. From the plane of religious parallel and connection, the mighty Narmada River appeared to me as the strongest link of positive energy from mankind to the energy of the serene and omnipresent Lord Shiva, as we say it in Bengali, Jatra Jeev Tatra Shiv. Drawn highly towards the scenic captures by the author, as she enslaved the beauty of the surroundings of the river in her flowing words, I perceived the transition of the daytime to the nighttime as the change of mood of the divine Shiva. The very nature of the river Narmada is all-embracing. Somewhere, the author also touched upon how water as an element of the earth unifies all those who are grieved and denied justice. Also, the river Narmada, like a mother, has embraced all religions within her, thus putting out the concept of secularism on our platter. From the story of the monk, I perceived that too much of anything leads to corruption of everything. All of us are encompassed in Maya, and that illusion is like a fine line, transcendenting which will lead us to our truer selves. It struck me how beautifully the author reduced wealth to nothing but confetti as it was showered on the crowd of the grand ceremony. Also, the concept of violence gains a new perspective here, and that is that the very fear of violence, the very fear of falling down becomes the cause of violence. This non-violence is nothing but understanding of the fact that there should be no fear of falling down. as ma'am said earlier, the character Tariq Mia gets a major line in the novel, which becomes the identification for the next theme of the book, that is love. And that line is, the human heart has only one secret, the capacity to love. What an enchanting revelation it was. It really is the greatest secret we hold. In all the stories, love has been introduced in so many forms, be it the love of the monk for spiritual awakening or the music teacher's love for Imrat. Now, of all the short stories, the one which touched me the most is the courtesan story. The story in itself opened doors to multiple thought-provoking pointers. Some of them are truth, identity of women, meaning of true learning, awakened soul, and many more. Most striking of them is the name of the river itself, as most of us mentioned it earlier, Narmada, which in Sanskrit means a whore. It almost redefined the concept of false accusation transferred from one generation to the other. In the courtesan herself, a figure of Bodhisattva could be found who, even if had the chance of escaping the one whom everyone had identified as evil, she stayed making the bigger picture about Rahul Singh's revenge. Mainly, I viewed the story through a feminist lens, which helped me unpackage what tremendous respect should be attributed to courtesans for their capability to learn and perform in such mysterious ways and propagate as well as transfer knowledge from generation to generation. Somewhere, the true identity of a powerful learned woman, as suggested by Laureate Ernstine Rose in her dealing with the feminist perspective of atheism, is brought out through the understanding of an apparent negative character's thought, Rahul Singh. Rahul Singh actually valued what and how courtesans were to be valued, with what is justified, which also made me draw a connection with what is justified like always seems evil. With modernism becoming a path for transition, the courtesans are nothing. The mother of the courtesan aptly unravels how women are nothing but flesh to those who know nothing about art and humanity. She says, scholars, artists, musicians, dancers, we are only women to them. Our true function is and be recompensed by some tawdry necklace flashing its vulgarity on a crushed pillow. All in all, this book encompasses the learnings of price stages carefully locked up in the waves of the flowing mystic Narmada. That's all from my presentation, ma'am. Thank you.
Superb, Shikriti. You brought all the threads together. I like the way you spoke of the whammy of the beginning of the book and then connected it to the end. You brought the Bodhisattva idea in. I think the intersectionalities you elucidated, superb. Thank you so much. Okay, looking greatly forward. Shomita Basu, looking forward to a couple of observations by you as such a renowned artist amongst us. Are you there? Shomita, can you see her on the screen, anyone? Possibly not. Okay, so then let's turn to one of our most favored participants, Dr. Roma Bhattacharya. Roma, are you there?
Good evening, Julie D.
Good evening. All the way with great accolades from Oxford, with the United Nations, so knows the mysteries of the human heart on a lived experience level. Go ahead, Roma.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you to Bengal Club and to you, Julie D, for inviting me and that absolutely wonderful, visually rich introduction, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I think that this time we have a very different book, very different from Coetzee at least. Having just lost my own beloved mother, this book spoke deeply to me, as I too have been ruminating about metaphysical issues of life and death, being and meaning. I was fascinated by the book, which revealed its treasures to me like a lotus flower opening. It starts off about a tale about renunciation and realization, and one may be gulled into thinking this is a tract on ancient conventional Hindu philosophy guised as a tale. But soon one encounters a piercing modern voice that interrogates received convention. Charity, largesse, giving away of wealth without giving of oneself or acknowledging and getting to know the poor and human beings as human beings. So the ancient encounters the modern. However, the novel holds many other levels of complexity. I would assert that the frames through which we look upon the world are offered to us sequentially. The Jain renunciation and ahimsa, the Sufi songs of love and ecstasy, and finally, all these frames are interrogated by the surprise of modernity. The ascetic transforms from renunciation to engagement as a professor of archaeology, and yet nothing is final. The ambivalence of life remains. It's full of surprises at many levels. In fact, the first scene was rather like a Bollywood film for me, the Jain ceremony. But why I found this book such a treasure trove and important, unlike Kurtzi, I've been asking this question, Julie, from the beginning, is this book truly post-colonial philosophically? And I feel that here Mehta truly writes what I think is a paean to India. It's ancient civilizations from Vedic times to even prehistoric, the Stone Age, the indigenous cultures, India's diverse philosophical traditions. The novel inhabits ancient Indian poetry, literary forms from Kalidas, Shankaracharya, Sufi songs. The book can almost be entitled The Wonder That Was and Is India. And this book is important because unlike Kurtzi, there is no underlying binary or references to the Western social imaginary. However, on a very minor note, I personally had some ambivalence with its subtext and exploration of gender and sexuality, where sometimes for me, patriarchy was reproduced and the incipient discourse on violence, if there was ever a time to discuss, I would go more into it, but there was a bit of it that didn't quite work for me. While overtly, the suicide and the monk thrown into the river with the flaming coal, because the book's level of abstraction, it's taking you to the philosophy of violence, the philosophy of non-violence. And sometimes for me, the book didn't rise above it in this sense. But other than that, the book is a tour de force. It made me want to go and live in a guest house in front of the Narmada with the waterfalls resounding in my ear in the deep dark before sunrise. Thank you so much.
Super cool. As always, super cool. Brought in associations of post-coloniality, modernism, and the problematic areas that Ms. Mehta doesn't quite possibly, those hurdles are not crossed. Thank you so much. Thank you, Roma.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
You're very welcome. Sana Hashmi, all the way from Toronto. Sorry we've kept you waiting. Are you there, Sana?
Yes, I am. Hi, Julie.
Yay.
How are you?
Lovely, lovely. Okay, go for it.
So thank you for your presentation earlier. It was very informative and everyone's presentation so far. I want to say that this was a very enriching reading experience. I think Gita Mehta did a very good job of evocatively weaving together a story around the legend of the river Narmada. At the end, when Professor Shankar, an archaeology professor, ends up being the same ascetic who saved a young girl from a brothel, the book successfully brought together in this character the disparate elements of myth and science, tradition and modernity, what is old and what is new. I just want to bring my attention to a quote that stood out to me on page 264. This is when Professor Shankar is talking to the narrator and others about the history of the river, and he says, what we are seeing today is the same river that was seen by the people who lived here 100,000 years ago. To me, such a sustained record of human presence in the same place, that is immortality. I really liked this quote in particular, and I think it does a great job of speaking to the main theme of this book and leaving the reader with something very profound to think about. Thank you.
Very on point. Wow. That is indeed a line that I didn't remember for a very long time, Sana, that this river has been there for a very long time and it's going to be there even after we have gone. Profound. Thank you for that. Shebonti, our very esteemed librarian who has been with the Bengal Club Library for the past nearly 20 years now. Voracious reader, masters in library science. Okay, Shebonti, looking forward to your cryptic but always on point comments. Go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. I believe that one of the most striking features of this book is the technique of narration. The technique that the author has used is partially similar to the epic Mahabharata, where Vyash does not himself become a character, but he writes the epic. Similarly, Mehta also narrates stories, but she herself is not any character at any particular story. The novel highlights not only one specific character, but with the help of numerous characters, Mehta expresses the psychology of the human mind and she examines the diversity of this nation. Mehta emphasizes on the fact that it is futile to seek nirvana anywhere else because one can find true salvation only in one's own self. That is all I have to say. Thank you.
Prodigious point brought to the fore again, and I think the last three speakers, Dr. Bhattacharya, Sana, and you have hit home that very subtle, nuanced, but the core of the book. I think what Mehta's trying to say is that self-realization from within and non-judgmental, ever-forgiving love, which Anshuman Munshi also spoke about earlier. Those are the two abiding principles of a happy existence. Thank you so much. It's been overwhelming to see the kind of response and the participants who've been here and listened all the way from Singapore, Toronto, Thailand. I don't know what to say. I'm just so grateful for all of this and for our speakers, both from the club as well as from across ponds, across puddles. Thank you so much. Looking forward to our July discussion, which will be on the Booker Prize winning book, Raka. I'm having a absent.
At night, all blood is black.
Thank you so much. At night, all blood is black. Gory book, different, very different from River Sutra, but I think we'll have a whole lot of fun. We always do.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, ma'am.
It was a
Goodbye
wonderful
for now.
program. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you,
Julie.
everyone.
Thank you.
Anusuya,
Bye.
Vivek.